The number didn't just echo, it detonated. $250,000? The words left the HOA president's mouth with an almost theatrical sharpness, slicing through the stale air of the clubhouse. Every chair creaked as neighbors leaned forward, jaws slack, whispers bursting like sparks across the room. $250,000. It was not a fine. It was a financial guillotine. Karen, the loudest and most venomous voice on the board, adjusted her glasses with a smug flick of her hand. Her lips curled into a smile that wasn't joy but victory. She began to recite the offenses with the precision of a prosecutor stacking charges. His grass had grown half an inch too tall. His shed was unauthorized. His back fence, hidden from the street, was painted in a shade not pre-approved. Each accusation was more absurd than the last, but she delivered them with cruel satisfaction, savoring each like a blade twisted deeper. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some muttered under their breath. Others avoided David's gaze entirely. Everyone knew the HOA could be harsh, but this was beyond punishment. This was a public execution wrapped in paperwork. And at the center of it all sat David. He didn't flinch, didn't lean forward, didn't even frown. His hands rested on the leather folder in his lap, its corners scuffed from decades of use. His calmness was infuriating to Karen, who thrived on breaking people, on watching them fold under her words. She leaned closer as if daring him to argue, to show anger she could exploit. But David remained still, a mountain in the path of a storm. The silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. To most in that room it looked like defeat, but to anyone truly paying attention, there was something else beneath it, a quiet weight, a patience so deliberate it unsettled even those who wanted him crushed. Karen's smirk widened. She thought she had him. The board thought they had won. But what none of them understood, not yet, was that the very ground beneath their feet was already beginning to shift. This was not the story of a man about to be broken. This was the story of a system about to collapse. Long before Oak Ridge Estates had manicured lawns and rows of identical mailboxes, it was untamed earth. Marshlands stretched wide, tangled with brush and wild oak. The land smelled of damp soil and possibility. No developer wanted it. Too muddy, too remote, too unprofitable. But David's grandfather saw more than swamp. He saw foundation. He purchased it for a fraction of what it would one day be worth, and with his own hands, he carved a life into the stubborn ground. He built a cabin from timber he cut himself. He cleared fields until the soil was rich and black, tilled rows that yielded corn and beans, and planted fruit trees whose blossoms drifted like snow each spring. His children were raised there, barefoot in the fields, their laughter carrying through the orchards. Generations later, those trees still bloomed, whispering the family's claim to the land. Developers eventually arrived, lured by the growing city nearby. They carved parcels out of the once-forgotten ground, erecting homes, paving streets, naming cul-de-sacs. They promised order, uniformity and prosperity, wrapping it all in the bow of a newly formed homeowners association. Families moved in, lawns were manicured, rules were written, and power began to centralize in the hands of a board that saw itself as judge, jury, and executioner. But David's family had never sold everything. The heart of the land, those central parcels, the ones developers thought insignificant, remained in a carefully preserved trust. The deeds were tucked into the same leather folder that David now carried, their ink faded but still binding, stronger than any bylaw or board vote. They weren't just papers. They were bloodlines. When David returned years later, after working in the city, he came not to conquer but to protect. His life was quiet, his house modest. He didn't meddle in HOA politics. He asked for nothing but peace. Yet his independence made him an outsider. And outsiders were dangerous to people who thrived on control. The board mistook his silence for weakness. Each fine they levied was another needle. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. Annoyances, but never enough to provoke. Until now. Until 250,000. What they didn't know, what they had never cared to ask, was that David's silence wasn't surrender. It was patience. And patience, when it finally stands, is stronger than any rule book. Karen leaned forward, venom in her voice. 30 days. Pay in full or we begin seizure. Her words rang like a gavel, final and cruel. A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some wide-eyed, others whispering. To them, this was the endgame. Surely no man could withstand such a blow. David finally moved. He set the old leather folder on the table with deliberate care. Its weight was not in leather or paper, but in history. The room seemed to lean toward him as he unfastened the clasp, the faint snap echoing louder than Karen's decree. The first sheet he pulled was a map, yellowed and fragile, edges curled with time. It traced every street, every cul-de-sac, every parcel in the neighborhood. Karen smirked, assuming it was a desperate attempt at drama, but her smirk faltered as her eyes narrowed. Realizing how old the document truly was, then came the deeds. One after another laid out like a gambler's winning hand. Parcel numbers, boundaries, notarized signatures from decades past. Each page was a reminder. Before the HOA, before the developers, before the rows of neat houses, there was ownership, his family's ownership. The silence grew heavy. Neighbors craned their necks, murmuring in confusion. Karen grabbed a deed, scanning furiously for flaws, for loopholes, for anything she could twist. But the ink was undeniable. These weren't fakes. These were truths carved into the legal foundation of the land. The realization spread like wildfire. The board froze, their confidence draining as they understood the weight of what lay before them. The manicured park they boasted about? His family's land. The clubhouse they sat in? Built on his family's lease. Even Karen's own house, her fortress of pride and control, stood on ground tied to his name. For years they thought they ruled him. In reality, they had always lived under his shadow. David let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the documents do what his words hadn't yet needed to. Then finally he spoke. His voice was calm, measured, almost soft, but every syllable struck harder than any shout could have. "You find me $250,000, he began, his eyes steady on the board. "But if I raised your lease fees tomorrow, it would cost this neighborhood millions." The words hit like thunder in the quiet room. Neighbors gasped, their whispers swelling into a storm. Eyes turned, first to David, then to the board, then back again. The unshakable authority of the HOA, the rules they had enforced with smug certainty, crumbled in that instant. Karen's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, she looked small, diminished in the shadow of the truth before her. The board members exchanged frantic glances, whispering among themselves, their authority collapsing into panic. The neighbors, meanwhile, saw the truth clearer than ever. For years, they had watched the board wield power like a cudgel, enforcing rules with arrogance. Now they saw that power dissolved with nothing more than a folder, a few old papers, and a quiet man's voice. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The ground beneath them had shifted, and everyone in that room felt it. The board huddled, voices trembling as they whispered. Finally, one cleared his throat, announcing in shaky tones that the fines would be reconsidered. Minutes later, the entire penalty was erased, their arrogance dissolving into fragile apologies. Karen tried to protest, to recover her authority, but her words died in the air. No one listened anymore. David closed the folder, gathering his papers with the same calm he had carried into the room. He rose slowly, his presence steady, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, not in triumph, but in quiet resolve. He spoke once more, his words simple yet unshakable. "Respect," he said, "is not something you enforce. It's something you practice." The words lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. Neighbors nodded, some even applauded softly. They looked at him differently now, not as the quiet outsider, but as the man who held the ground beneath their feet. David walked home under a night sky that seemed brighter, the air lighter, as though the earth itself had exhaled. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His silence had never been weakness. It had been strength. The strength of roots running deeper than any rule book. True power, the neighborhood learned that night, isn't loud or boastful. It doesn't sit at the head of a table barking rules. True power is the unseen bedrock beneath the ground others stand on. And in Oak Ridge Estates, that bedrock had always belonged to David.